Good evening, everyone. This is the day 3 of the Scrum training with Terminal Inner Academy. We're going to be going quick today because we have a lot of material to cover. And before I keep going, I think there was a question yesterday. Somebody was trying to ask questions about the PSM certification. Is the question still holding? Okay. Looks like not. Aside from that, is there anybody else who has any question before we start? Okay. So yesterday we started talking about the Scrum process. We spoke about the different events that exist, the artifacts, and the call roles. So we started with the call roles. We described what the product owner is doing. We also spoke a little bit about what the Scrum Master is doing, and I think we stopped at this slide yesterday. Okay, so the third component important into a functioning or well-functioning Scrum framework is the dev team. And I remember I told you many times yesterday and before that the Scrum is originally from the word scrummage, which is a term used in rugby, for two teams trying to restart a game and going head to head to get possession of the ball. Okay, so Scrum heavily depends on the development team. Okay, and the dev team is responsible for delivering the product. Okay, every single sprint there is a product increment that should be created, and that might be a feature, it might be two features, but is a portion of the definite and final product that has to be created at the end. And every iteration, you need to produce a specific product increment. Okay. And the dev team is responsible for that. So the dev team is actually the one doing the work. And there are many characteristics that the dev team needs to have. They need to be first composed of people between 3 and 9. And you shouldn't be going over 9, and you shouldn't be having teams less than 3, because research and experience has shown that if you have teams less than 3 and more than 9 trying to run Scrum processes, it's not going to be fully and well done. Okay, so the teams are limited to 3 to 9 people maximum. I've seen people having up to 13, depending on the application that they're building, depending on the culture, the company culture. Sometimes, you can get away with that. But as a rule of thumb, you should be sticking to the 3 to 9 number. Okay. And they actually the team that does the work. I said it. They do the analysis, the design, the development, the testing, the implementation, the maintenance, etc., etc. So this is reminding you, I'm assuming, all the steps that we described when we spoke about the waterfall model. You have pretty much the same steps, but they are widespread on the whole life cycle of the project. Okay, whereas for Scrum, you have those steps reduced to iterations and repeated many times. Okay, and the team is also self-organizing. They decide what they want to do, how they want to do the work, and they negotiate the scope of product backlog that they want to include in each increment with the product owner. Okay, they might also interface with the PMOs that are also responsible for the global vision of all the projects and dependency that are going on in a specific company for a portfolio, for a program. Okay, and the team, again, is not having any leader. There's no manager of that team. There's no lead of that dev team. The team is self-managed. The team decides on what rules they're going to abide by. I give you an example 2 days ago about things that, funny things that the teams as rules can put in place, like having people showing up late pay $1 of late fee, for example. Okay, that's decided by the team. There's no boss that imposes that on the team. They sit down, they have the meetings, and decide how they want to organize themselves. So the roles or the responsibilities of the dev team listed here: responsible for doing the work. We said it. The size 3 to 9 is a cross-functional team. I explained yesterday that the team needs to be independently completing all the work by themselves without relying on any external party. Okay, so you need to have everything or everybody that needs to be on the team to perform the work, like developers, people who are testing, people who are designing, back end, front end, database folks, everybody that is necessary to achieve and complete a feature and release it after the specific sprint. Okay, and they need to be allocated to the team full time. So in other words, it doesn't mean that they need to be full time with the company. You can have, and actually you do have a lot of contractors that are part of the dev team. Okay, but that just means full time allocated means that the dev team is allocated, the members of the dev team are fully allocated to the dev team. Okay, so you cannot have one member of the dev team being allocated to another dev team. That's not possible. Okay, so you should have a dev team comprised of members that are fully allocated to that dev team and that dev team only. Okay, they're self-organized, they're responsible for the quality, meaning if there's a problem with the product increment, let's say you're supposed to have done all the work, tested everything, verified the quality, and then you release it in production with the product owner approval, and down the road in production there's some issues, there are some defects. The responsibility of that work is relying on the whole team, not on the people on that dev team who tested the product. Okay, so everybody in the team, in the dev team, is responsible for the quality. And they do also the estimation of every single user stories that they pick up or product backlog items that they pick up to be worked in a sprint. And we're going to talk about the estimates at the end of this course, the techniques and how it really works. Okay. Let me see. I think I have people trying to get in. Give me a second. I think I saw 2 people trying to join. Let me see. No, here we go. It just disappeared. Okay, can you guys still see my screen? I think something moved. There we go. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Sorry about that. All right, so now we can talk about, after talking about the core roles in the Scrum framework, now we can talk about, I'm trying to get people in, but for some reason I can't click that. Give me a second.
I don't know if you're talking, but we lost the sound, unless it's only me.
You are muted. We cannot hear you.
You are muted, Stephen. We lost you. We lost the sound.
Hello?
There you
Okay,
go.
I think I was on mute.
Yeah, you were on mute.
Okay, got it. So I was saying that yesterday, I was telling you guys about the difference between Scrum events and Scrum ceremonies or Scrum meetings. What's the difference? Does anybody remember? Anybody remember? All right, let me pick Simplis. What's the difference? Are you there, Simplis? Okay, Jacques.
Yes, hi. So from what I remember that, sorry, I'm just going to put my video. So we've said that something like the sprint is an event, and but we have ceremony in the process, and we're saying that, for example, the daily Scrum meeting is a ceremony included.
Right. So that's exactly right. This yeah, I'm gonna.
This is what I remember.
Yeah, that you got it right. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I just like doing that with people who have their cameras off. So anyway, so yeah, that's the correct answer. Yeah, that's the correct answer. You do have 4 Scrum meetings or ceremonies. They're also part of Scrum events, but the only one that is not a ceremony but is still part of the Scrum events is the sprint. So all of them are events because they're time boxed. The sprint is 2 weeks. The daily stand-up meeting is on 15 minutes. The retrospective is 3 hours. So we're gonna get to that anyways, but they're all time boxed, and the ceremonies and the meetings are actual meetings, okay, that have short period of times where you discuss stuff. You don't really do actual work, but the sprint is for doing the actual work. That's when you produce the increment. Okay, so the meetings that we have are the Scrum daily stand-up, the retrospective, the sprint review, the sprint planning, and at the end, or sometimes in the middle, you have the refinement. But that's not really an event. It's not a ceremony either. It can happen anytime. You're gonna get back to it. Okay, so this is actually the structure or the flow of a specific sprint in terms of artifacts and in terms of processes getting into it. So initially, you do have the product backlogs that is built and maintained or managed by the product owner. Okay, and from that product backlog, which has all the features that needs to be developed for the product, right? And we pick up user stories from that. We call them product backlog items. And for each and every sprint, we have a set of product backlog items that we negotiate between the dev team and the product owner, given the capacity of the team that we decide to work on. And based on those product backlog items, we produce a product increment at the end of the sprint. So that's what you see here that becomes a sprint backlog. So whatever we pick up from the product backlog, we do move it into the sprint to be worked in with the plan to work that in. That becomes the sprint backlog. Okay, and we work on that till the end of the sprint. And during the sprint, you have daily stand-up meetings where the team is providing the work or showing their progress every day, and asking if they need any help, or saying if they have any impediments or any blockage. Okay, so it's every 24 hours. And this 2 to 4 weeks, that's the duration of a sprint in general. And at the end, you can see that you're going to have to produce a product increment that is potentially shippable. That means every product increment should be having a value and should be ready to be released. It doesn't mean that it has to be released, but it should be in the standard or a state such as it can be released at any time. And that's a question that you're going to be seeing a lot in the test. Okay, they're going to be asking you questions like, after a sprint, do we have to release a product increment? The answer is no. Okay, that's a tricky question. The answer is no for the reasons that I just mentioned. The product increment needs to be a piece of functionality ready to be released. That's what shippable means. Means needs to be ready to be put in production. So be ready to be shipped, be shippable. That's what it means. Okay, but it doesn't mean that it has to be, that it must be. Some teams, when they're planning their work, they do have what we call a release calendar. So they have specific time in the year or in the month, depending on how they're doing it. But usually it's maybe monthly. They have monthly releases or quarterly releases every 3 months. Okay, and they say we're going to be building the product increment every 2 weeks. But as we building the product increment after 4 sprint, for example, right, that's a month. Or if you're on a week sprint or 2 weeks, that's going to be two sprint. After 2 sprint, you can have a product increment that is big enough to be shipped and released into production. Okay, so it would mean that if you have a quarterly release, you're doing that every 3 months. And if your sprint is 2 weeks, it means that you have 6 sprints that you need to go through, 6 iterations that you need to go through before releasing the product that you have at that point into production. Does that make sense? Questions?
Yeah, I have a question. At what time do we have UAT testing here? Because I don't see that anywhere in the
What time do we have what?
UAT, user acceptance.
Oh,
testing.
UAT. That's a good question. So let me come back on this. Everything is done during the sprint. Okay, so I showed you what was that? The step. Wait, there we go. So the steps: analyze, design, develop, and what? Test. So UAT is user acceptance testing. So you're gonna have all the testing done within the sprint. So if you're having 2-week sprints, then within the 2 weeks, you need to make sure that you do the analysis, you do the design, you do the development, and you do all the types of testing that you need to be doing before releasing the product increment. Okay, so that's done during the sprint. In the waterfall model, they're usually doing it at the end of the project, and that's why if there's a problem then, or the customer doesn't like what he sees or she sees, then it's a big problem, because we need to come back now with all the effort that we already put in and money that we already spent. We need to come back and fix things, right? When we could have had the opportunity to do it before if we were using the Scrum process. Does that answer your question? So all the testing is done during the sprint. Every work that you need to be doing on the product increment for it to be released or releasable, you need to do it during the sprint. Because again, anytime you have producing a product increment, it needs to be production ready. That means that it needs to be releasable. And if you're going on the waterfall model, before anything goes into production, you do have functional testing, you have integration testing, you have regression testing, you have UAT, which is user acceptance testing. All that is done before you release anything in production. The same thing happens with the sprint. Okay, so it means that you're going to be doing it after 2 weeks. You're going to be doing all that during the 2 weeks. Every time you do an iteration, you make sure that all those steps are included into your sprint. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. Any other question? All right. So here, just to finish with this slide, you can see how all those different events are succeeding each other. So you have the sprint planning meeting that's usually at the beginning of the sprint. Okay, I'm going to explain to you when we go in details into those events, what we do in each of them, right? You have the sprint planning meeting. This is the whole, like this whole timeline, if I should say, is what constitutes the sprint. So all those events or ceremonies are happening during the sprint. Okay, so during one sprint, you do have the sprint planning meeting, usually happens at the beginning of the sprint. You have the daily Scrum, or what we refer to as the daily stand-up meeting. Okay, it happens every 24 hours. I showed that to you here. And at the end, you have the sprint review, the sprint retrospective. Okay, that's where it stops. So that's where you have the sprint 0 completed or sprint 1 completed. Then after that, you have the next sprint that starts right away. The sprint planning meeting for that sprint number 2. You have the daily stand up every day for the 2 weeks or whatever amount of time you allocate to a sprint. And then you're going to have another sprint review meeting here. You're going to have another sprint retrospective there. And then right after that, a new sprint planning starts for the sprint number 3. So everything that you seeing here is actually to explain one other thing to you. That is also a tricky question that usually comes during the PSM exam. They're asking you, when does a sprint start? And the answer to that is right after the previous sprint. Okay, because they're going to be asking you stuff. Can you do anything, any work in between sprints? No. After a sprint stops, the next one starts the next day, right away. Okay, and they can put that question, they can trick you differently and put that question in different kinds of way to confuse you. But the ultimate answer to that is the next sprint start right after the previous one. Okay. All right, so the sprint is a fixed length event of 1 or less than calendar month, or 4 weeks or less, 2 to 4 weeks. Okay, the new sprint starts immediately after the conclusion of the previous one. I just said it. That's a thing to remember. No change in the sprint backlog that endangers the sprint goal. So that means that once you have started the sprint, you picked up what you need to be working on for that sprint. That is part of the sprint backlog. Okay, so it is a small set of product backlog items from the product backlog that you decide to work in that sprint. That's the sprint backlog, plus the plan to implement it. So when you pick that up during the sprint, you shouldn't be making any change to those items or add things if it's going to endanger the sprint. What I mean by endanger is if it's going to put the conclusion and the production of the increment at risks. Okay, so you shouldn't be adding stuff randomly and everything that you decide to work on during that sprint, you need to work on that. You shouldn't be adding additional stuff or changing requirements or user stories in that sprint backlog during the sprint if it's going to endanger the sprint. That's what it means. Okay, it doesn't mean that you can never do it. Okay, so the catch is if it's going to endanger the sprint. Okay, I've seen that many times, and we do that all the time, matter of fact, even if it's not a good habit. But it's when we're confident that maybe what we picked up for that sprint, the product backlog items that we picked up for that sprint, we're almost done with it. We didn't well, before the 2 weeks, so we still have time to do other things. Then we can sit down with the product owner and say, hey, we already built all those things. We think we can also do those additional things and add them to our product increment for this sprint. We still have time. We still have capacity. Okay, and if everything is fine, you can pick some more items from the product backlog and add them into the sprint during the sprint. But that's if and only if doing that is not going to endanger your sprint. Okay, so that's what it means. No change in the sprint backlog that endangers the sprint goal. Team works on all tasks and sprint backlog items decided from the sprint planning. I just explained it. The product backlog is refined as needed during the sprint. So what that means is and I'm going to talk about it also a little deeper later on. There is a refinement that is going to happen during the sprint, but the refinement is not an event. You have refinement meetings, okay, whenever needed, because the product backlog is an ever evolving artifact. That means that it's changing all the time. It's getting reprioritized, and I gave you the reasons why that might happen, right? Because the market might change. The business value that you might want to bring with a specific product backlog items 2 or 4 months down the road might not be the priority anymore. So the priorities of what is getting developed, the features getting developed, is ever changing. And also you might have some more user stories that are added, right, by the product owner. Okay, so that's why the team is going to be potentially doing refinement every single sprint, and is not at any specific point of time. The refinement is basically clarifying and adding more details to the user stories so that it is clear enough to be worked on, okay, by the dev team. So the refinement is happening every sprint at any time. So the dev team can just decide that, okay, they have some items on a product backlog item while doing their work that they need to have refined because it's right now not too clear, or there's not much information into it, so that we cannot develop it yet. Okay. And when they refine it and is refined well enough, it's going to be moved, it's going to stay in the product backlog, but it's going to move into a status that is ready to be worked on in the product backlog items. And if the priority is high enough, it's going to be picked up the next sprint. Okay. So any item that is not completed during the sprint is rolled over to the next sprint. So that means, let's say you did your sprint planning, and sitting down with the product owner, you guys negotiated that you're going to be picking up 3 features to develop, right, from the product backlog items. And the 3 features, at some point, you can only, for some reasons, right, you can only develop and finish up 2 of them. Okay, for whatever reason, I don't know, somebody left the job, or somebody was sick for too long, or you had people were not capable of working, whatever reasons, right? And for that, you're only able to complete 2 of those features of the 3. Okay, so what happens is the negotiation also needs to happen with the product owner, and the product owner can accept the product increment for that sprint that has the 2 features instead of the 3. Okay, or he can just decide that he doesn't want to accept it, and everything needs to be worked in together, and the product increment needs to come with the 3 features. So if he does accept that, okay, you're supposed to be building the 3 features during the sprint, you are only able to do it for 2, but it's still going to be, if you release the product increment with the 2, it's still going to be well functioning and bring value. Okay, I can go ahead and accept it. If it's the case, then the dev team is going to take that 3rd feature that they couldn't develop, they're going to put it back in the product backlog, right? And when the next sprint starts, they're going to pick that up and put that back in that sprint's backlog. Does that make sense? That's what it means by any item not completed is rolled over to the next sprint. Okay. All right. And the product owner can cancel the sprint if a goal becomes obsolete, right? It means that you might be working on a specific sprint, and then maybe after a week and a half, the functionalities or the features that you're developing are not used or needed anymore because the market conditions changed, right? So there's no need to finish that piece and to release that in production because it's probably not going to bring value. So in that case, the product owner can decide that they cancel the sprint, right? And when they cancel the sprint, then we're dropping all the features that were developed or half developed. And next sprint, we're going to be working on something else. So that fosters adaptation, one of the key principles of the Scrum process. You see, you can do that at any time, and it's not really going to impact the development or of the product, the whole product altogether too much because you did it early. Okay, and it was only developed on a subset of the product for 2 weeks. That's not long. So if a product, for example, is 2 years, if you do that on a 2 weeks basis, then it's not really a big deal. But if you wait till the 2 years have elapsed, and then you're trying to do changes at that time, then you probably need to change and redevelop a lot of things, right? And it's going to impact your wallet and require you to put some more resources and extend the deadlines. Okay. All right. So speaking about the sprint planning. Okay. So the sprint planning meeting, like I said before, is at the beginning of this, say it's a sprint. So you have that whenever you start the sprint, usually the first day, okay, you do have your sprint planning, and it happens early before you start the sprint, actually in the sprint, but the first event, right, that is happening during the sprint and early in the sprint, usually the first day, is the sprint planning. Because what? Why? Who can tell me why the sprint planning is happening early and usually the first day of the sprint?
I think that's where you decide on the sprint backlog.
That's what it is. That's the answer. So correct. The sprint planning is happening early in the sprint and usually the first day, obviously, because without sprint planning, you don't know what you need to work on for that sprint, right? So before you start working on anything, you need to know what you want to work on, right? So when you start the sprint, you need to figure out what you're going to be working on. So you sit down with the product owner, and there are 3 topics mainly that needs to be addressed, right? Who attends that meeting? Mainly the dev team, the product owner, the Scrum Master to facilitate the meeting, and sometimes any subject matter expert that might bring more information or more insight into what we're trying to develop. Okay. So the topic number 1, why is the sprint valuable? So the product owner is going to propose how the product will increase its value and utility in the current sprint. So that means that they need to choose what they want to work on that is the highest priority. So that's what it means to why the sprint will be valuable. So what do we choose to make, to develop, to make this product increment and this sprint valuable? Okay, so that means that you already have your product backlogs prioritized, and you know which ones are supposed to be picked up the first, the second, the third, right, in order of priority. And the first ones are the ones that are bringing you the more money or the more value when you do the development, right? So that's what you need to decide on. And then the whole Scrum team, the Scrum team is made of the product owner, the dev team, and the Scrum Master. Every time you hear about a Scrum team, remember that it's those 3 categories of people. They collaborate to define a sprint goal. Okay, so a sprint goal is what is the business problem or the business case that we're trying to solve, right? What is it around? Because usually if it's a feature, that's the business case that you're trying to solve. Let's say have an account creation a feature, right? You want to make sure that the customer is able to create an account. That's the goal. If you're picking up only one feature or one product backlog item, and it's that one, then that would be the sprint goal. If it's many of them, maybe you want to create a web application where people are able to register for classes, and that involves creating an account, signing up for classes, and having an integration of their schedule to the calendars. Maybe that's what you want to do, and the goal is having people be able to sign up for classes. That's the goal. Okay. The topic number 2 is what can be done for during the sprint. The developers have a certain capacity, right? They cannot do everything, and the capacity, we're going to talk about that later on as well, is usually compared or used in reference to the velocity. Okay, so if you hear about velocity and you don't understand that now, we're going to get to it, don't worry. So the capacity of the team is what they use to decide how much work they can take on for a specific sprint. Okay, so the developers select the items from the product backlog for the current sprint. The Scrum team might refine these items during the process, so they can also do refinement during the sprint planning. So let's say there are some high priorities product backlog items, right, in the product backlog that are to be worked on, but it's not really refined, meaning it's not really clarified. All the information that needs to be there are not present yet. They need to discuss that and add more information. That's a refinement process. They can do that during the sprint planning. And once it's done, usually they do what we call the estimates in terms of points. And based on that, We know the capacity of the team, how many points they can do for a specific sprint. Is it 80? Okay, so they need to be taking the sum of all the sprint backlog items needs to be around 80. So that's what we refer to by answering the question, what can be done during the sprint? Okay, so the developers forecast their capacity based on their velocity and the definition of done. We're going to come back on the definition of done as well. Okay, and the topic number 3 is how will the chosen work get done? This is about planning. Who is going to work on what? And that's again where the self-organization of the dev team is coming into picture. The dev team is going to plan the work necessary to create and implement. Who is going to be doing what? What step are we going to be needing to do? When are we going to be doing testing? What backend development do we need? What front-end development do we need, et cetera, et cetera. And they're going to develop tasks or create tasks for each product backlog items that they develop, and the team is going to pick who is going to do what, self-organizing themselves to do that. Okay. All right, let me stop here. I'm going to take questions when we come back, but we have to stop and come back at in 10 minutes. So at 7:19 Eastern time, we're gonna reconvene. Okay. All right, I'll talk to you in 10 minutes.